So I'm Charlie Stripp. This year I'm president of the Maths Association, and through the year I'm going to interview a few people that are like prominent in maths and maths education to get some. I want to discuss with them some concerns I've got about particular challenges that I think maths education faces. And there are three things I've highlighted. So one is around public attitudes to maths. One is around the teacher supply problem that we have in mathematics, and the other one is about how there's been a kind of real reluctance to use technology to enhance how maths is taught. And that's an ongoing, those three things I think are ongoing issues in maths education. And I'm interested to see whether we can find out, ways that we might try to address them, because, obviously maths education is so important. So today, the person that I'm talking to is a lady called Kathryn Greenhalgh. And Kathryn is the Executive Director of Maths for the Outwood Grange Academies Trust. And she's also co-lead for the Yorkshire and Humber Maths Hub. And even more than that, she's chair of the Maths Hub Council, and the Maths Hub Council it represents the Maths Hubs nationally. So the reason I know Kathryn well is because in my role as director of the NCETM, and the NCETM is responsible for coordinating the work of the Maths Hubs, and so Kathryn is somebody that I work with quite frequently in that role. Kathryn, being the executive director for maths in a big multi-academy trust. I think that the two things that she's definitely keen to talk about are around attitudes to maths and also around the supply of mathematics teachers. I think a little bit about the first one, but I think a lot about the second one, because we know in the current environment the supply of maths teachers is very, very challenging. So Kathryn, over to you.
Yeah, well, I'll start off by describing the kind of geographical reach of the schools that I work in, and it'll give you a flavour then of where I come from in what I'm talking about. So all of our schools are in the north of England, and there's 28, and they go from all the way up in Middlesbrough down to Chesterfield and Worksop over to Scunthorpe, and actually there's a couple of schools over in the west of the country, but we're all northern. In that, although we do have some schools that are really amazing in terms of the low numbers of pupil premium intake that we have, we also have some who are quite amazing in the high numbers of pupil premium children, the proportion of students who are from a disadvantaged background. So I think we'll maybe start off by talking about pupils' attitudes to maths. And what we've seen and what I've seen as I go around the schools that I work in. I mean, it's absolutely varied. And I have to say that if a child has got a thirst for maths early on in life, actually, they'll still have it when they go through school and go into secondary school, because they love getting things right. They're quite excited by that. And actually, for some students, it's a real calming and joyful experience to do maths. Which is great if they're captured. But as they get a little bit older, there are other things that distract them in terms of, really their focus on their education versus their focus on their social life or
growing up.
Different influences. Growing up, different influences they have on the life. And home situations and all of those kinds of things really can influence how a student is within school, and what actually their priorities in life are. And that's when it becomes harder to keep them engaged and excited about maths. What you do find, though, is if a student hasn't already captured that understanding of how useful the subject is, or how beautiful the subject is, or how brilliant it can be for opening so many doors, if they've not got their head round that by a certain point, it is very difficult to shift that mindset to enable them to understand actually why it's so important that you get a good grade in your maths, even in your maths GCSE. We're not even talking about going beyond that at this point with some children.
Okay, and so I mean, can you give me just thinking about the types of children that you're in touch with? Can you think of sort of examples of that, or things that perhaps have worked, or things where you realise that where you realise there's a problem and been able to address helping the students to become become more motivated and become more committed to their studies.
Yeah, I mean, where they have a really good teacher who they like, that helps with those situations where students are lacking in intrinsic motivation. Because we do find that there are, in some of our circumstances, some of our contexts, there are children who they're not intrinsically motivated to go away and do any extra work, and actually they are sometimes far too tired or distracted during the day to even be able to focus on what's going on in lessons. But where there is a really good relationship with the teacher, where good relationships are formed and the teacher really knows the children or the students and vice versa, I do think that works incredibly well. Lots of opportunities for the students to see that they can get something right is also really, really helpful. So we do think that it's really, really important for children to be able to, reason and problem solve with maths. And also, student fluency isn't just about being able to, replicate loads of things over and over again. Being fluent is then to be able to kind of use that language of maths and understand the connections. But we do find if we give them plenty of opportunities in lessons to achieve something and feel that sense of pride, not feel a constant sense of failure, that has a really positive impact.
Yeah. So giving opportunities to be successful in maths is a really good way of motivating them. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a bit of a game of winning hearts and minds, because once they start to see some success, that does create that like endorphin rush or whatever it is, dopamine hit, where they feel proud of themselves and they want to experience that again. So they're looking for it in then perhaps something a little bit more challenging. And over time, that can have a really beneficial impact on certain students within your classroom. But you have to manage that really well in your classroom. You have to know the students and know where to pitch it. So it is really important that you're thinking about every individual student when you're planning for your math lesson. I'm not saying you sit and plan 30 lessons, but you need to have an awareness of the group. And is this a group where I'm going to have to go a little bit more slowly with the smaller, earlier steps in order to be able to accelerate at the end? Or actually, is this a class where I could, regardless of their background, their home background, could I come straight in with something that poses them a question because they're ready for that, But yeah, definitely, I think that allowing them opportunities to feel success is a really winning formula for many students from that kind of background. One of the biggest problems we find, though, is that we've got quite high student absence, and this is really difficult when teaching a subject that's so hierarchical like maths is, because any missed lesson could actually impede the ability to then flow into the rest of that sort of topic, and it makes for sort of navigating that classroom as a teacher, it makes things really difficult. And this will come into the section when we're talking about teacher recruitment, but it's big considerations around ensuring that every student is ready to progress onto the next element of the learning. That's really hard work. And again, it's a really experienced teacher would be able to manage that really, really well.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. The point about being ready to progress to the next bit of maths, and if you've been absent from school, if your circumstances are such that you're not attending school well, then that can, I suppose, that maths perhaps more than many other subjects, it can kind of seem like a hopeless case because you when you're back in school, suddenly you don't know where you are because you've missed out so much.
Well, we absolutely find this, Charlie. And one of the things, and I spend quite a bit of time in a school working with students who have had quite a bit of time off. And when they come back in, it's really difficult to get them to actually stay seated in a classroom because they've got all these like Well, they don't want to look stupid in front of their peers.
Yep.
They're totally aware that they've missed loads of work. They're so nervous about going back into that room that then their behaviours that they exhibit to get themselves kicked out so that they don't get shown up in front of everybody else, or even refusal to go in the first place. You know, that actually contributes to these internal truancy problems. Yep. And you know, they don't want to be in that classroom for fear of looking stupid. So I mean, you know, this is a model that is expensive, but it's very worthwhile, is that you get a member of staff who is great at forging really kind relationships with that kind of students, to actually sit down with them and work with them either on a one-to-one basis or in really small groups on the maths that they really need to be able to access lessons. And we're talking some absolute basics. Fundamentally, you know, just like some competency and automaticity, perhaps with some basic number processes or whatever. But we found that actually sitting down with some students in this really small environment where they're really carefully looked after, because they're clearly vulnerable and need that support, developing their confidence so that they feel confident enough to go back in. And we have seen success with that. We've seen students go back in to lessons. We've seen other students from their classes asking why they've not had this special treatment, you know, and actually asking for it. But it's not a cheap model, that, and you need to really consider how important it is, alongside all of the other things that you also have as massive priorities in a school budget, you know.
Yeah, but I can see the idea that if you're, I mean, one of the things that maybe turns people off maths is the idea that if you've missed something and then suddenly you're completely at sea and you're feeling vulnerable because you're worried that you can't do things that people around you can do, and if you're in difficult circumstances, that's just compounding the problem. And so what you're suggesting is it's a way to try to address that and help those young people through that difficulty. Yeah,
absolutely, because to them it's just a sea of red. They go into that panic zone. And once you've got a student in a panic zone, it's actually really difficult to even negotiate them down from that point anyway. And I do think there is a really strong correlation between students with these behaviours that we're seeing and how they're feeling about themselves in front of other people in a classroom and all of that. Yeah,
and obviously the kind of secondary age is I mean, young people are very sensitive at that age, aren't they? And so that they can end up being very defensive and very it becomes a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. That so the kind of intervention we're talking about, what you're saying is that if you can organise that, you know it can work.
Yeah, and we've also found that in our schools where we do have the higher levels of deprivation, we also do seem to have, there's quite a strong correlation also with our SEND numbers. The ones that I've been working in, there is, you know, it's not as strong as a correlation as some things, but there is quite a positive correlation there, that, you know, the more and what that means is when you have got a typical maths classroom of 32 students, that is tricky as well, behaviour wise and attention needs wise and adaptations to your lessons wise. So you may have a class that's classed as a top set, yet the kind of personality of that class is very different to perhaps a class that might teach in a more sort of affluent central region, and just like a completely different picture. And I experienced this because, you know, on a Tuesday I'll be teaching up in Middlesbrough, and on a Thursday I'll be teaching in Wakefield, and it's a real different picture. And I think that is also going to, if we're not careful, not help the children keep really engaged in maths, because when you can't give enough attention, the right attention to the children, then the behaviours start to bubble again. And even a math magician, or even when I've got them sometimes in the palm of my hand, and I think I've got this, and then as soon as then all the elements of their neediness come out, then you're running around dealing with all of that, and some children then have to wait. And if you've got a less experienced or a less confident teacher in front of those children, then it's really hard for them to manage that classroom environment expertly, and therefore children begin to get bored, and then they will start to muck about, and then they'll be talking to each other, and then the noise increases, and then for the other children that's not the right conditions for them to learn in. And I think that could also impact on actually how much they love going to their maths lessons. In honesty, I do think that has an influence also on how expert the teacher is in dealing with that size of the classroom with all those sort of variety of needs.